All right. So we're just a minute after. I see some people continuing to sign in, but let's go ahead and kick things off for those who are ready. Again, today's discussion is all about DR planning, disaster recovery planning. Gabriel and I have found that the beginning of the year is a very common time for people to work on their DR plan. Some people on the call may be working to bolster and improve their DR plan, while some of us may have just the idea of a DR plan and we want to get something more concrete and really begin an official DR planning this year. Whatever case may be for yourself, we're going to try to go through a checklist of things that we've identified as important. And specifically, we'd like to highlight some things that we find that our users sometimes overlook when they're doing their own DR planning. Got some of those pieces missed here. Again, if you're just joining the call, if there's another aspect of DR planning that you'd like discussed today that you don't currently see in this list, feel free to drop that topic down in Q&A, and Gabe and I will do our best to cover it during today's presentation. Gabe, if you want to kick things off, sometimes we're so focused on our on-prem environment that sometimes our clients will overlook third-party applications or things not in their direct vision. Could you talk about some of those applications and other pieces that need to weigh in the DR planning process?
Yeah, so a lot of people, exactly what you said. They worry about their servers, their data, what they're actively using, what they're doing, and what they don't consider, or they consider a moot point in many cases, are the third-party risks that are involved. If you're hosting your data at a data center, there's third-party risk right there because someone could have access to that. Other people have access to that data center. They could get in your cabinet. They could get into your stuff. And while there are security precautions in place, hopefully to minimize those risks, those are risk scenarios you should be testing. You should be asking for compliance documentation from your third-party vendors. You should be working towards. And a lot of people leave those things out. They consider those like a good example is software as a service. Many of the things, like think of Salesforce or NetSuite, something that's up in the cloud, not necessarily Office 365, because a lot of people recognize backing that up, but they don't think of backing up Salesforce, or they don't think of backing up other cloud applications. Oh no, Salesforce takes care of all that. And the reality is that they don't. They don't take care of all that. It is the responsibility of you to do that. And so testing those risks, understanding those vulnerabilities is really incumbent to the IT professional that's managing that thing. So having that involved is important. Next slide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead. This is one that
no,
can
go
be
ahead.
overlooked. This was one that can be overlooked as well because we're so used to building our security fences to keep the bad actors out. We sometimes forget that sometimes threats can come from internal as well.
And it could be, everyone thinks like the hacker is this dark, moody guy in a hoodie that's getting into your environment, but really it could be anybody doing something that is not following policy that's opening up your risk, right? Clicking on that link they're not supposed to click on, or I had a good example of, I was talking to a guy the other day, new to the IT department, just brand new to the company, didn't know what half the servers did in his environment. So he didn't know what the impact of old software was. He's like, yeah, I came across something that we haven't used in 10 years, but the server is still on. Well, that's a risk, because if that server hasn't been used in 10 years, you could have viruses on there. You could have infiltrators that have hacked into that because it's not getting software updates. It's not getting security updates. And they could be leveraging that as their base point of operations to infect your entire network. So those type of things happen, but really you see it a lot with accidents. You see a lot with, Bob from accounting did something because he's in accounting. He has this elevated level of access to things and did something that actually impacted the entire company. Understanding and controlling those levels of access, while a pain to manage, is definitely important.
Yeah, for sure. Whether accidental or malicious, we need to protect ourselves from our users as well.
And you need to test those scenarios, right? That's the other part of whatever I talk about here today. It's not just about um, managing those risks. It's about including those in your disaster recovery testing scenarios because those could be what you actually face in real life. They're much more likely than a hurricane in many cases, right? If you live in Wisconsin, you're not going to get a lot of hurricanes coming through. So testing these scenarios becomes just as important.
Yeah, I know you are. You're going to repeat that probably many times during the presentation, and there's even a slide dedicated to it. But DR planning is not a document that you do once and you check it off. It's really a living, breathing operational practice where we need to test it
Correct.
and go through scenarios to make sure there aren't things that we haven't thought about.
Correct.
One thing that can go off the radar is old software or old applications. You and I have both witnessed this with our clients or with people in the news where an forgotten application has vulnerabilities in it, and that ends up being the weak part where someone can enter into your system.
For sure. I mean, just think about the issues that Southwest had because they were running something on a Windows 2003 server. Um, it becomes the linchpin, the keystone in your archway, and it just makes the whole thing crumble. Outdated software is a specific security risk that is exploited more than anyone likes to admit. But the other big risk that people take is using what we call unauthorized software. So I've seen people that use their own note-taking tools, right? That are storing it in some separate cloud from the company's information. And while it might help you productively, do your job, it opens a security risk because there could be information kept there that is not being secured, it's not being looked after, and it's not being backed up. And so those become a way that can be exploited. So personal apps is a big one, web-based apps or mobile apps where it's not a company sanctioned thing, but you're using it for a company purpose becomes an issue.
And I say that we see this a lot with manufacturing companies or anybody who has maybe written an in-house application and maybe it's tied to an old operating system and the pain of updating it and moving is why they've left it on this outdated system.
Yep.
But
A lot of 32-bit software still out there.
as those get older and older, then the vulnerability patching will stop at some point, and now you're in a risky situation. Of course, the hacker's always looking for the easiest way to enter your environment before causing havoc.
Yep, for sure. I mean, we still see customers with Windows 2003 out there in the environment, and it has been end of life for a decade. So it's definitely a problem that we still come across that people do need to address.
Well, this goes back to DR planning not just being a document, but being a living operation. And I think also in this part, the DR planning, one of the common mistakes I think we witness is that it's handled in silo by IT. And while IT is leading that charge, every department is involved in DR planning.
Yeah, and this goes even more. I see more people fail a DR test because the DR test doesn't have redundancy. So I'll give you an example of, let's say your primary communication method is a phone tree, right? So in a disaster recovery, you're going to call the people involved, you're going to give them status updates or whatever, and it's going to be through the phone. Well, if your scenario is you just had a hurricane and it wiped out your phone system, how does that work? You don't have a phone tree to call, so you have to have a backup method. You have to have alternate ways to communicate. You have to have a redundancy, not just for the communication channel, but who you communicate with. If the IT guy is on vacation and he's on a yacht in the Caribbean, what do you do if he's your only IT guy? Who's the backup plan? all of those steps of your DR plan need to have redundancy built in the same way that you have dual power supplies, or you have multiple switches in your environment, or you know, multiple network connections coming in to give you internet access. All of those redundancies are the same type of redundancies you need in the planning phase, and that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, it's a great point. That redundancy not only applies to infrastructure and systems, but also to people. When Gabe and I have talked with clients before about DR planning, it's very often an easy way to stick a branch in someone's spokes is to say, hey, let's do this next DR scenario, but minus this important player. And now we've realized that sort of our entire DR plan hinged on this one person. So if they're not available, then what's next? So I think it's really important to make sure there's redundancies and test those scenarios. Okay, what do we do if we don't have this piece?
That's correct. Absolutely.
All right, we'll talk about this one. Like you said, hurricanes and tornadoes, those do happen, but the number one disaster that almost all IT professionals will face before the end of their career is cyber attack. So how does that factor into the DR planning?
Well, so it is like, and I'll use 0 day as my example for this. It's almost always going to be something that's unpreventable. Like, if I could have prevented it, I would have. But in a 0 day attack, I don't have that option. So how you address it and how you handle those cyber attacks becomes your path forward. And it's going to go into one of the other slides with insurance and legal and that kind of stuff. But um, the way you manage to that, the way you explore those things, you have to regularly review your policies, your security, make sure you're patching, make sure you're doing all the things to minimize that attack vector, I like to call it. But those things are still going to happen. So how you address it becomes, okay, this has happened, you know, that scenario has to be tested. And it hurts someone's pride. You know, IT guys take pride in what they do in securing their environment and doing their thing, but you still have to test the environment of, if this happens, what do I do? And a lot of times that's the exception to the rule, right? That's the, oh, we're not going to worry about that right now. No, that's actually the one you have to worry about the most.
Absolutely. And what percentage of the time do you think that someone's getting in via, they're not getting through the security defenses directly, but more someone's letting them through by clicking a link or downloading something they shouldn't have, like a user error
Phishing attacks
caused.
happen all the time. They happen all the time. It's probably the most common way someone gets into your environment is through one of those things, because you click on it and you think, oh no, I don't want to do that. And you close it. It's okay. They're already in. They're in. And they're not going to do anything on your machine so that you know they're in. They're going to just use you as a base point to start their listening, start their watching, and work out from there to infect the environment. Um, Phishing attacks is the most common way people get in. I mean, a good example is the MGM and the
Caesars.
Caesar's Palace. Those happen due to, you know, someone clicking a link they shouldn't have clicked.
Yeah, so social engineering, I think they actually called in and pretended to be someone and said they'd lost their credentials. And then so they reset their credentials, and then the person was basically given a key to access the environment.
Right, and
You're
they found the information on that person by looking them up on LinkedIn.
The phishing
So
attacks, I mean, they're
it
nonstop
happens.
and yes, and so
Phishing
inevitably
attacks are
somebody makes a
nonstop. With
mistake.
the evolution of AI, they're becoming more creative and critical. They're not cookie cutter anymore. They look legit. They sound legit. You have to be very careful.
Yeah. All right. Well, here's an important piece that can't go without talking about are the
Sure.
backups, and not just assuming that the backups are working, but testing those and having ways to verify it. That way, we don't go to rely on one of those backups in a disaster scenario only to find out that we didn't have good data to recover to. Can you talk about how we should work that and make sure that we're having good data, secure data in a DR scenario?
So I'm going to give it to you in a different way. I see a lot of IT people. I talk to them all the time, and almost every IT person has some project. There's some application, there's something that's changing in their environment. It's always happening. There's constant change for IT guys. And what they do is they go, well, when we're all done with these projects, then we'll worry about the backups. Well, then you're leaving a window of time where you have incomplete backups. You have solutions in place that are probably important to production. Otherwise, you wouldn't have done the project, but you're not backing it up. You're not protecting that data. And that becomes the worst case scenario, because if something happens during that time frame before you get around to it, you'll lose that. A lot of things I see is they'll have an outdated solution. They'll have backing up to, and I don't want to badmouth tape because it definitely has a place, but if you're backing up to tape and they have a 50% tape loss rate and you're, using the same tapes you have for the last 10 years, chances are your data is not going to be good on those tapes. And the time to recover is extended. So outdated solutions cause extended recovery times. Not keeping up with the data growth is another good one. People will buy a solution that has so much space on it, and they'll overfill it, and so they'll reduce retention, which causes its own susceptibilities because you don't have as much data for as long of a time period. It puts you out of compliance. It might void your insurance because you didn't follow the policies and procedures that you signed up for. Those things all affect your ability to recover in a disaster. And then last but definitely not least is not testing. I've had so many people that do a file test. Oh, well, we restored a file, so we know it's good. We know all the data is good. One file does not beget all the data on any of your backup solutions. And being able to bring up a full recovered server and test it is as critical, if not more critical, than doing a single file recovery test.
Absolutely. Yeah, we don't want to be unpleasantly surprised in the event of a disaster. That's for sure.
For sure. Cascading failures.
Yeah, jump right into that one, Gabe.
Yeah, so cascading failures. I'll use the simple example. Everyone tests their Exchange server, they test their backups, they know it works. Well, what if it's Active Directory that goes down? Or what if you lose a switch that's plugged into your Exchange server and it's the only switch you have in the office? It doesn't matter if the Exchange server is good, you can't access it. Cascading failures is any device or application or service that works in the middle to make the other services work. And often one of those dominoes falls, it knocks the rest of them down. And being able to test those scenarios and add them to your DR plan, recognizing what those dependencies and those inner workings are is super important and often overlooked, just because most people say, oh, it's going to be fine because we can do this and we can do that. Test those scenarios. Make sure you walk through that in every way, shape, or form.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make a comment. I see some questions rolling in. I think I'm going to tie them into some slides as they coming up, but please keep
Sure.
them. Please keep the good questions coming. And I promise I see them. We're going to get to them just as the slides make sense here. You'd mentioned about this before. Cyber liability insurance has become a must for all organizations, and it's also becoming increasingly complicated. Can you talk about the importance of the DR planning and how that ties into cyber liability insurance and making sure that if you are hit, that your insurance will cover your claim?
Yeah. So a lot of your cybersecurity insurance policies are reliant on policies and procedures that you may or may not have implemented. And so knowing what those procedures are is as important to your production facility as it is to your DR planning. A good example is, one I used before. If the company is bringing up servers right after a disaster, like they have ransomware and they decide, oh, we're just going to fail over to our failover solution and bring them up, but your insurance policy states that you need to actually call them first before you bring things back into production, you avoided that. So if you bring it back up and you're still infected and you make it worse, then your policy will be void and you won't be able to get paid out on it. So including them in your DR planning, including them in your DR testing is as important as everything else that you're doing. Um, it is business wise, it is the most important part of your DR plan is knowing what your policy is and how it will be affected by your disaster. Knowing how many backups you have to keep, knowing your retention times, your compliance requirements, being audited to those compliance requirements so that you know that you're passing, to make sure that if and when you get ransomware or you get infected by a cyber threat or a disaster of any kind, that your policy will cover that disaster.
Yeah, I know that you're always speaking to that like in your DR plan, the very first thing you want to do in almost any disaster is reach out to your insurance team, because as insurance companies do, a lot of times they're looking for a reason to not have to pay the claim. So you want to do everything that you can to follow their procedures so there aren't any excuses for you not to be covered.
Absolutely. And knowing that liability and being audited to that is very important. So if you don't do any third party audits, add it to your guys' list. It should be done.
Yeah, no, the third party audits are always helpful as well, I think, because a lot of times the thing that you're not thinking about is more easily pointed out by another pair of eyes, and that very thing that we're overlooking can be what really bites us in a disaster scenario. So it's always nice to have
Absolutely.
someone overlook it. And again, like you mentioned earlier, sometimes we know the difficult scenarios or where our vulnerabilities are, and so we'll kind of lean away from that, where if we have a third party person, they'll kind of hold our hand to the fire there and make us address it.
Yep. A good example that I'll give you is a lot of IT companies have put multi-factor authentication in their environments. It's a great thing. When you first set up multi-factor authentication, it gives you a set of codes for when if the world falls and goes on fire, that you can still get into that system. And a lot of people lose those codes. And that becomes okay, let's do the scenario. You can't multi-factor authentication log in. How do you get into these servers? And you don't have those codes, you're out of luck. So having policies and procedures on how you manage those codes, where you keep them. The best practice that I have that I try to recommend to companies is you take your multi-factor authentication codes, you print them out on a piece of paper, you put them in an envelope, you seal it, you give it to accounting, you say, put this in the safe or wherever you keep safe papers. And so if we have a disaster, we can get to these. So it's not in someone's desk. It's not in Bob's desk that retired 3 years ago and it got thrown away when we cleaned it out. It's in a safe, secure location that you can always get to.
Yeah, it's a great point to have the information somewhere else. That way, in case an employee does leave, that we don't lose access to important systems.
Correct.
Um, Speaking of change, what exactly does change fatigue mean, and how does that apply to the DR planning phase?
Wow, just hopped right one thing right into another. So perfect. MFA works into this scenario very well. Um, a lot of companies I see they'll implement security features. Hey, you got to use multi-factor authentication, or you've got to have a VPN to connect to the office, or whatever they are. And they'll say, "Oh, I'll go talk to the IT guy." And he goes, "Yeah, we got everybody, well, except the CEO, but he didn't want to have to deal with all that." Well, he's like one of the most important people that you have to have do these security things because he has such an elevated amount of information that he has access to. And it might not be IT access, but his data that he has is just as important as an IT access data, because he'll have CEO level data that he has in his mail and his files and whatever he has access to that now is not as secure because he's not following the rest of the policy that everyone else is following. Or you put in a new piece of software, security software, and you implement it for some of the servers, but not all of the servers. So it's monitoring the critical pieces of the environment, but not all of the pieces. And those are what are compromised. And this resistance to all these new tools and all this stuff and the costs and the implementation time and energy that it has to take to implement these, that pressure forces people to um, either accept that risk or deviate from what should be implemented fully, and leaves a vulnerability in place because of the amount of change that is going, because ransomware has evolved at a very, very fast pace. And as scanning tools and monitoring tools and security protocols all try to keep up with that, that's a lot of change in an IT environment that traditionally wasn't always there, and that causes this fatigue, this oh, I don't want to deal with that right now. I'll do that next week or next year or whatever, and that leaves that vulnerability and that risk out there, where again it could void your insurance policy.
Well, I think technology and our IT departments for so long have been focused on making things easier and more efficient for the business. And now with the nonstop attacks, we're kind of having to pull back a little bit and say, hey, this might not be the easiest or the fastest, but we're going to make a little bit of sacrifice there to make sure our system is secure.
Right.
And one of the questions we had, and I'll throw at you now, Gabe, is
Sure.
how should the DR plan best be communicated across the organization, kind of with this change fatigue in mind and getting other departments and the full company involved?
It's a good question. So there's layers to that. There should be the call to arms when you first create the thing. Hey, company, this is what we're doing. You're going to see changes because of that. We're going to be interviewing key people in different departments to adapt it and keep that thing. But it's going to be a living thing. We're going to keep redressing it, and we're going to keep coming back to it. And that communication can't just be a broadcast once. It has to be a, this is the way our company works. We value and take pride in our ability to recover from a disaster as a company, not just the IT staff. It's not all on their shoulders. In fact, very little of it is on their shoulders. It is the company as a whole that needs to take responsibility for that. So it's in every security training you give. It's in every monthly departmental meeting you give. Hey, for the DR piece, it becomes a bullet that you talk about every time. Hey, make sure you're checking your emails and you're not clicking on links randomly. Hey, make sure you're, hey, we added this new application. I fed it back into the DR plan. So that's going to change our SLAs for this or that. That communication chain has to be a constant living thing and part of the company. And there should not be secrets in the DR plan. There should not be, we only talk to so and so about that. You should be able, for a DR plan, you should be able to get everyone involved because they're all part of making it successful. So they all need to know, hey, if the office burned down, I'm going to be working from here, or I'm going to be remoting in, or I'm going to be, they all need to know those things so that if that communication thing that we talked about earlier breaks down, they know what the next steps are. They know how to follow up. A lot of people print it out and put it in a binder and they say, here, keep this at home, but then it never gets updated. Or, they put it on a file on the server and they say, here, just go here, but that's the server that's down. There's lots of ifs and ands about it, but the best thing I can say is constant communication and education. Make sure that your chance for success is the best. I hope that answered that
No,
satisfactorily, but
yeah,
there's
no, you did
there's
it.
a
And
lot of pieces that it could affect.
yeah, totally. And I think at a high level, what we want every department involved, and we want a key stakeholder for each department. And ideally, each one of those is going to have a backup person as well.
Right.
And like Gabe said, those departments are almost more important in the DR planning phase and the IT because we're supporting those people. So if they say, here's what the business needs, now we need to figure out how we're going to be able to deliver that in all the different disasters. Got a bunch more questions, so I just want to warn people we're probably going to run a few minutes over, but I want to try to get to everyone's questions that we can. Marty had asked, you mentioned about printing important codes or multi-factor
Yep.
authentication things in a folder and giving it to accounting. He
Yep.
asked, is an online vault not a safe place to store those codes as well?
Well, 60% of ransomware attacks right now are happening online. Not many
So
people get into your vault in the office. I'm just In
Yeah.
all honesty, I mean, that's the vulnerability that's out there. Is that's the key to the kingdom. If it's in a public place or somewhere where someone can get to publicly and it can be pushed and poked and prodded until they get access, don't put it there. Putting it on something in someone's vault is a very safe way to do that.
Mike asked if the calls be recorded. Absolutely. And we'll send it out to everybody who attended. And these webinars are always on YouTube if you want to go back and watch it again. Roman, I might need a little bit of clarification. He said we have third-party audits, but all they're doing is checking to see if we have the bureaucracy in place, the policies that we're doing this or that, but they don't really verify that they're working. Is that something that we should be doing ourselves?
So there's different types of third-party audits. There could be a SOX audit, where they're basically doing exactly what you said. They're making sure you have policies written and you're following those policies, but they're not going to actually go look at data. But then you could have an audit like HIPAA or PCI where they are going to go look at that data. So it depends on the type of policy and the type of audit that you're doing, but you can always ask your auditor, hey, I want to do pen testing, internal and external. I want to do intrusion prevention, phishing attack testing. All of those things exist, and most auditors have like a menu of different audits and functions that they can perform. So adding those to your scope should be doable.
Thank you. Okay. We kind of mentioned this and we've talked about it, but while documentation is important, this isn't complete it and then putting it away. It's something that we're regularly testing and reviewing. How often should we be revisiting the DR plan, or am I thinking about it incorrectly and it's something that's continuously being reviewed?
So as a whole, it should be reviewed once a year. And that's soup to nuts, right? You go through every page of the plan, every step of it, and you walk through and you make sure that everything still applies. But on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or quarterly, it really depends on the company and how you guys function. But is more frequent is better. But I would say that reviewing the important aspects or any changes to the policy, that's the time I would do those. So, hey, we added an application, we changed a user, we did these things. Those events should trigger the change to the policy. It should be part of the event. So, like when a user leaves a company and you disable their accounts, it should also go into the DR policy and say, hey, they're not in any key communication roles. They're not in we're not going to be sending them an email to their Gmail account because of this, or we're not going to be calling them. So all of those things need to be updated. Um, all of the data that they might have had access to needs to be disabled, but it probably needs to be backed up and put in a secure location. Those events that change in your environment should trigger the update to the DR plan, and then the plan should be those updates should be sent out to the key departments so that they know those updates are, and then those should be communicated out to the users from there. So almost it's an event driven process, but at least monthly or quarterly, it should be for sure, like as a project plan, you get in a room and you make sure you've done the things that you're supposed to do for the events. So it's a checks and balances.
Someone just brought up a really good point. They're saying that they agree with you. I think that the maybe storing a document in a safe is makes it more secure from people being able to get it online. But they're saying, what about the event of what if it's not a cyber attack? What if it's a fire or a flood that maybe have destroyed the building and maybe we're not able
Right.
to access the documents, or maybe even the documents are destroyed? Do you have an answer to how we can protect from that?
Well, when I say save, I'm thinking at the bank, a PO, a security box that most companies have for the critical documents at the bank, but
Offsite,
offsite.
offsite.
But it could be that you have multiple copies in different locations, and you know what those are. But I would not have them with a person. I would have them with an entity. So like at a bank or at um, a sister company's office or something like that, where you have it in a secure location that you can get to, but it's not controlled by one person. What you're trying to limit is, oh, Bob in IT has it. Well, Bob's been gone for 6 years. I'm sure he doesn't have that document anymore. So you want to have it in a place where you know you're going to be able to get to it um, offsite, but is a secure location and immune to most things. Oh, I know
Thanks,
this
Gabe.
slide.
Thanks for letting us shoot at your feet here and dancing live. Yeah, well, disaster recovery, we've talked a ton about the DR planning, but we'd be remiss if we didn't to talk about having a really secure backup and recovery solution at the heart of any DR plan.
Yep.
You want to talk to some of the key components that people need to consider of their DR solution to make sure that their DR plan can be actioned.
Sure. So in a DR plan, especially for the servers and what we're going to really focus on here in this slide with Quorum, you want it to be in the same way you want the codes to be printed and in a secure location, you want the data to be air gapped. You don't want it to be on the network where it's fully accessible, because then the same problems you have in production with being susceptible to ransomware, you're going to have on the backup. So you want an air gapped solution. You want all the data that you have to be encrypted. And the reason you want it to be encrypted and in a mutable state is because if someone gets on there, you don't want them to have the ability to delete it. Encryption is there at rest and in transit. So as data travels over your wire, it needs to be encrypted. As it resides on your disks. In the however unlikely scenario that someone got into your data center, literally stole the server out of the rack and tried to restore the data, you want that data encrypted at rest. And then, of course, going along with that, when you're in a disaster and you have ransomware, you're going to need to follow a set of procedures that's going to create an environment where security people can come in and look at it to see if the data is clean, and make sure that it's clean before it's put back into production. So what they require is a clean room environment. Quorum appliances come with a test environment already built into them that provides the cybersecurity professionals a clean room environment to test all of those backups to make sure they're clean and not infected with any spyware or ransomware, so that when you recover it back in production, you have that confidence. And so having a clean room in your backup solution is also important. And then the last but not least is if you have a ransomware that affects, let's say, your hypervisor level, so your VMware, your Nutanix, your whatever, you need to be able to have a compute level where you can recover to, because you're going to need to rebuild all of those production servers. So to get back up and running while you're doing that, having that compute built into the appliances is a critical piece to recovering in a timely manner. And so we provide all of that both on our appliances and in our cloud to fully recover in the event of a disaster.
Yeah, and a lot of those points can be solved by having a dedicated a server or an appliance that's solely dedicated to backup. It does not host any production servers or data. Like Gabe said, we want it to be completely separate and different in every single way, which would include a different network, which is where the air gaps comes into place, but different storage, different hardware. That way, if our production equipment is compromised, if we have a good backup, that's great. But if we don't have a place to recover it to, then it doesn't have a lot of value. And then what?
Sorry.
The last thing I'll mention is that we want to have separate passwords as well, right? So that way, if somebody gets into our production server, we want to have a separate password. So now they don't have the password to our backups, because our backups are our fail safe for when someone gets through our security defense. And so that's just another layer we want to make sure that it's completely separated in every way, including logins.
And just adding right on to that is that concept of zero trust. So the appliance doesn't want to trust DNS. It doesn't want to trust domain credentials. It doesn't want to trust anything that you have in production, because in the event that all of that is compromised, the backup solution still needs to work. So zero trust has to apply as much or more to your backup solution as it does to your production environment.
And if we're creating that really isolated and secure network for our backups, like how Quorum does, then a really valuable byproduct of that is the clean room, which gives us the space. Often the second thing we'll advise our clients do in a ransomware event after they contact their cyber liability insurance company will be to fail over to the Quorum environment because it's air gapped from the rest of your network. You've now unplugged from the production network, which will have severed the connection between you and whatever bad actor implemented the malicious software. Now you have a clean room to triage and find out how they got in to resolve the issue and then even test a recovery before we recover back into production. Well, thanks for everybody for hanging in with us. I think we've got to all of the questions. If you would like to learn more about the Quorum backup and recovery solutions itself, if you're reviewing your DR plan and you'd like some consulting, or if you have a good backup solution in place today, but you really don't have a good DR plan to go to and you're constructing it for the first time, we'd be happy to help advise and consult with that as well. So as a follow-up here, of course, we'll be reaching out to you. But if you have specific interest of learning about our disaster recovery solution, help revising your DR plan or putting together one for the first time, please let us know. Thanks everyone for attending. And Gabriel, thanks for leading us through this really valuable conversation.
Glad to help. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks everyone.